The American cowboy's voice rang out through the hot Texas air. "Line up, girls." The sound of boots crunching in the dust grew louder as a group of Japanese women, most of them still young and barely out of childhood, stepped forward hesitantly. Their clothes hung loosely on their emaciated frames, and their eyes, once filled with fear, now locked on the faces of their captors with confusion. They had been taught that Americans were monsters, savage, cruel creatures who would bring death and dishonor. But as they lined up, what happened next shattered everything they had been told. It wasn't cruelty that awaited them. It was something far more unsettling: kindness. And as they stood there, forced to question everything they had been trained to believe, tears began to fall. The women hesitated, moving uncertainly toward the commanding voice. The sight before them was almost absurd in its normalcy: a vast ranch surrounded by open fields and low fences. There were no guards with rifles, no jeering officers to humiliate them. The men standing in front of them wore dusty cowboy hats and loose shirts, their boots thick with the earth of the land they worked. These men, who had been painted as beasts, brutal creatures in the propaganda of war, looked anything but menacing. Instead of the soldiers they had expected, the women found themselves standing before farmers, their faces weathered and neutral, their eyes cautious but not cruel. The very lack of aggression felt like a trick. This couldn't be real. As the women shuffled into line, their thin frames creaking with exhaustion, memories of their training and the images they had been fed over the years surfaced. They had been taught that surrender meant disgrace. Their very existence was defined by the concept of honor, an honor they were told could only be maintained through absolute devotion to the emperor, through death rather than capture. The Japanese military had drilled these values into their minds for years. The Americans were savage beasts who would strip them of dignity, perhaps even their lives. These women had grown up believing that to fall into enemy hands was a fate worse than death. The brutality they had been promised was something they braced themselves for daily. The cowboys, in their silence, began to divide them into groups. There was no shouting, no orders barked at them. They moved with quiet efficiency, their faces betraying no particular emotion. For a brief moment, one of the women dared to look around. The sun was setting low, casting long shadows over the dusty land. The ranch seemed like any other. The air was still, and in the distance, cattle wandered lazily across the pasture. The only sound was the occasional creak of leather as the men adjusted their hats or moved about, quietly tending to their tasks. It was as if the women had stepped into an entirely different world, a world of peace and routine, as opposed to the chaos of war they had left behind. This unease was compounded when one of the cowboys offered a smile, small, almost imperceptible, and nodded to them. It was nothing like the leering, taunting faces they had imagined. This gesture, simple as it was, felt like a blow to the women's sense of reality. They had been prepared for men who would sneer at them, perhaps even mock them. But what they encountered instead was an unsettling civility. It was as though these men saw them as something more than war trophies to be claimed or broken. The women couldn't make sense of it. As the women were escorted to a small area, a makeshift camp near the barn, they struggled to grasp this new reality. The heat of the sun still weighed on their skin, but it was not the oppressive heat of a battlefield. It was the warmth of a world they no longer recognized. For a moment, they stood still, unsure of what to do next, unsure of how to respond to this strange, new world. It was not the paradise they had been told they would find, but it certainly wasn't the hell they had been warned about either. The only thing they knew for sure was that this would be a long, confusing road ahead, one that would leave them questioning everything they had ever believed. The women shuffled into the barracks, their bodies weighed down by exhaustion and confusion. Inside, the smell of fresh wood, soap, and something richer, more appetizing, clung to the air. It was as if they had stepped into another world, one they had never expected to see. The room was stark, simple, with wooden planks on the floor, rough-hewn beds, and woolen blankets that smelled faintly of soap. It was utilitarian, cold in its structure, but it was not the place of torture or humiliation they had imagined. There was no buzzing of flies, no clattering of boots, no whips cracking in the distance. The barracks were clean, almost too clean. There was a sense of order here, and that in itself felt wrong. Kiyomi, a young woman no older than 20, stood still at the back of the line, her thin arms crossed protectively over her chest. Her body, frail and exhausted from the ordeal she had endured, seemed to shrink further in the vastness of the room. She had heard the whispers before, the stories that circulated among the women. The Americans would beat them, starve them, humiliate them. But now, as she stood in the barracks, there was no sign of the violence she had expected. There were no soldiers shouting orders or scowling at them, no officers demanding respect with harsh words. Instead, the cowboys, who had so far shown nothing but strange silence, were now setting out food. Kiyomi's eyes darted toward the long wooden tables where metal trays were being handed out. She saw the food, real food, stew, warm and thick, with chunks of meat, boiled potatoes, and, most shockingly of all, crispy strips of bacon, sizzling in the air. Fresh bread, soft and golden, lay next to the stew, waiting to be devoured. The smell filled her nostrils, and her stomach growled. But the hunger in her belly was overshadowed by the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled in her chest. She stared at the tray in her hands, her fingers trembling. The meal was everything she had not expected. The food was rich, hearty, far beyond anything she had tasted in years. The last meal she had eaten in the hell of the war had been a thin broth, watery and foul, barely enough to sustain a body, let alone the spirit. And now, here, the very enemy she had been taught to fear was offering her sustenance. The temptation to eat, to fill the hollow pit in her stomach, was almost unbearable. But as her eyes flicked around the room, she saw the other women, similarly still, unsure of how to react. Kiyomi swallowed, the lump in her throat thick with the conflict raging inside her. She hesitated, her eyes drawn to the bacon. It sizzled on the tray, its greasy sheen glistening in the dim light of the barracks. She could feel the warmth of the stew through the metal tray, could smell the herbs, the salt, the richness of it all. And yet, as she held it in her hands, it felt like a weapon. Not a weapon of steel or fire, but of something far more insidious: betrayal. To eat the food would mean that she accepted this new reality, that she accepted what had happened to her, to all of them. Kiyomi's fingers tightened around the edge of the tray. The other women, too, were caught in their own struggles. Some had already begun to eat, their hunger overpowering their reluctance. Others, like Kiyomi, still stood frozen, the battle between survival and shame raging within them. One woman, whose body was even thinner than Kiyomi's, hesitated only a moment before grabbing a piece of bread and tearing into it. Her eyes closed, her expression a mixture of relief and guilt. A few others followed, but not without hesitation, not without the fear that by eating, they would be admitting something they couldn't yet face. Kiyomi took a deep breath and, with trembling hands, brought the spoon to her lips. She didn't want to taste it, didn't want to admit that this food could be anything but poison. But as the stew touched her tongue, she could feel the warmth spreading through her body. It was real. It was food. And as much as she wanted to resist, she couldn't stop herself from eating. The tears came slowly, but they came, hot and uncontrollable. She wasn't just eating, it was the first real meal she had had in years, the first sign that her survival mattered. But that recognition, too, was something that broke her. The shame of it all, the realization that she had been wrong, felt almost unbearable. The next morning, the sun rose over the Texas plains, casting long shadows across the camp as the women gathered outside the barracks. The air was cool and crisp, and for a brief moment, Kiyomi almost allowed herself to believe that she was somewhere safe. But then the reality of captivity came rushing back. The barbed wire still coiled around the camp, the soldiers with their rifles, the American uniforms, all of it reminded her that this was still a prison. But it was different now, a different kind of captivity, one where she was expected to do tasks, mundane things that made her question everything she had believed. Kiyomi stood in line, waiting for her assignment. One of the cowboys, his face weathered from years in the sun, came toward her with a clipboard. He looked at her for a moment before speaking, his voice deep but kind. "You," he said, pointing to Kiyomi, "you'll be feeding the chickens." The task seemed absurd. Why would the enemy ask her to care for life? She had spent years being told that survival was about destruction, not nurturing. The very idea that she would tend to animals felt like a mockery of everything she had been taught. To touch the animals, to feed them, felt wrong. It was a role she hadn't known in years, a role of compassion and care, not of war and survival. Yet, as she walked to the chicken coop, the familiar feeling of rejection crept up inside her. She wasn't meant to do this. She wasn't meant to be anything but a tool for the war effort, to take care of these creatures, creatures that were not enemies, but simply animals felt like betrayal. Her hands shook as she poured the feed into their troughs, watching them peck eagerly at the food, unaware of the turmoil inside her. But as the minutes passed, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden revelation, but a quiet realization that began to change her. The chickens ate, and she watched them, feeling an unexpected connection to these simple creatures. They were alive, and she was feeding them, not to destroy, but to nurture. She had been so consumed by the belief that everything she did had to be in service of war, of survival, that she had forgotten what it felt like to care for something, to give without expecting violence in return. When she finished, Kiyomi felt a strange sense of peace, albeit fleeting. It was as if, in that moment, the harsh shell of indoctrination she had built around herself cracked slightly. It wasn't a complete shift, not yet, but it was the beginning. She walked back toward the barracks, her heart still heavy but no longer quite so suffocated by the weight of her past. As she neared the entrance to the barracks, one of the cowboys approached her, carrying something in his hands. It was a thick, woolen blanket, new, clean, and soft. He handed it to her with a nod, saying nothing. For the first time since her capture, Kiyomi felt a spark of something unfamiliar. It wasn't happiness, but something close to it. It was a flicker of dignity, of humanity, in a place that had stripped her of both. She walked back into the barracks, the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders like armor. It was a gift, yes, but more than that, it was a reminder. She had not been forgotten. She was not a tool to be used, discarded when no longer needed. She was a person, deserving of care, of kindness, of simple, human things. As she lay down that night, clutching the blanket, she realized that the small act of giving, the simple kindness of the cowboy who had handed her the blanket, had done something far greater than any act of violence ever could. It had begun to rebuild her from the inside, piece by piece. The cruelty she had expected, the hatred she had been taught to feel, seemed more distant now. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in months, She allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she could survive this. The days blurred together as Kiyomi adjusted to life at the ranch. The work was hard, but not unbearable. She helped in the kitchen, learning how to bake bread with flour she had never seen before, the smell of it filling the air in a way that made her stomach growl in both hunger and disbelief. There were moments when the old habits, the old fears crept up inside her. At night, when she lay on the hay-stuffed mattress, she could hear the distant sounds of the American soldiers laughing and talking, their voices strangely unthreatening. They weren't the monsters she had been taught to fear, but they weren't exactly human either, not in the way she had once known humanity. She didn't know what to make of it. Then, one evening, it happened. The cowboys gathered around the campfire, their instruments in hand, and the first chords of a banjo filled the air. It was a sound Kiyomi had never imagined hearing in a place like this. She had heard music before, but never like this, never so free. The harmonica joined in, and the two sounds mingled in the cool night air. The music, simple and rustic, filled the silence that had haunted her for so long. It was a strange, almost absurd contrast to everything she had known, the sound of joy, the sound of life, breaking through the heavy, oppressive silence she had lived with for so many years. Kiyomi sat at the edge of the campfire, her back against the wooden wall of the barn, hidden in the shadows. The warmth of the fire felt good against her skin, but it was the music that drew her in. She couldn't stop herself from listening, couldn't help but be drawn to the simple beauty of it. It was a sound that felt almost foreign to her, like something from a life she had forgotten. She closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. It was an innocence she hadn't known in years. It was peace. For a moment, she forgot where she was. She forgot the barbed wire fences, the soldiers with their rifles, the scars of war that still lingered in her body and mind. She remembered, just for a moment, the way things used to be before the war, before she had been thrust into a life of suffering and loss. The music, with its lively rhythms and carefree melodies, brought back a sense of normalcy, a sense of humanity that had long been buried beneath the weight of violence and fear. And then breakfast arrived. The smell of bacon hit her before she even saw the food. It was a rich, savory scent that filled the air, overpowering the faint aroma of the campfire smoke. Kiyomi's stomach twisted at the smell, both from hunger and from the memory of the scarcity she had lived with for so long. She had not tasted meat in months. Her body had grown accustomed to the thin broths, the meager rice, the starvation that had become her daily reality. The idea of eating something so rich, so indulgent, felt wrong. She had been told that to eat food from the enemy was a betrayal, a weakness, and yet here it was offered to her as though it were a gift. Kiyomi took the first bite reluctantly, her body trembling as she chewed. The taste exploded in her mouth, overwhelming her senses. The bacon was salty, greasy, and so rich that it almost made her gag. It wasn't the taste that overwhelmed her, though it was the weight of the contrast, the sheer abundance of it. The joy of this food was something she hadn't experienced in so long that she didn't know how to handle it. She felt nauseous, not from the food itself, but from the sheer impossibility of it. How could this be real? How could she be sitting here, eating a meal provided by the very people she had been taught to despise? As she swallowed, Kiyomi felt the weight of it all settle in her chest. The hunger she had known for so long had been satisfied, but it left something else behind, a strange feeling, something almost like grief. This food, this meal, was a reminder of everything she had lost, everything she had been denied. It was a reminder of the starvation her people had faced while the Americans, the enemy, ate well and lived without fear. And then the laughter came. The realization settled into her slowly. Like the first rays of sunlight after a long, dark night. The enemy was not what she had been taught to believe. They were not savages, not beasts, not the evil forces she had spent years fearing. They were just people. And for the first time, Kiyomi felt a flicker of something unfamiliar hope, perhaps, or at the very least, the possibility that she might one day understand this world in a way she had never imagined. Days passed, and the rhythms of the ranch settled into a strange kind of normalcy. The work was steady, the meals plentiful, and the hours stretched long in the warm Texas sun. But within Kiyomi, something had shifted. The fear, the instinct to survive at all costs, still thrummed beneath the surface. But it was no longer the only thing that defined her. There was space now for other emotions, confusion, curiosity, even a fragile sense of peace. It was all new, all foreign, and Kiyomi found herself struggling to hold on to the things that had once defined her, the lessons of honor, duty, and loyalty to her homeland. One afternoon, as Kiyomi was walking back to the barracks after a long day of tending to the chickens, a soldier approached her. He was one of the cowboys who had shown her kindness, and this time he had something in his hands. He handed her a pencil and a piece of paper, then gestured for her to write. "Write home," he said simply, his voice steady but kind. Kiyomi stared at the paper, her fingers trembling as she held the pencil. For a moment, she couldn't move. The idea of writing felt impossible. She had not spoken to her family in months, not since the war had ripped their lives apart. How could she write to them now, when everything had changed? She had been taught to believe that surrender was dishonor, that the enemy would strip away everything she held dear. But here she was, sitting in the dirt of an American ranch, being offered paper and a pencil as if her words could still mean something, as if she still mattered. She hesitated, her mind filled with confusion. What was she supposed to say? What could she say? The words that had once seemed so easy to write, full of hope and pride, now felt like a betrayal. To tell her family that she was alive, safe, and well-fed, what would they think of that? What would the leadership in Japan think? How could she explain to them that the very people they had painted as the enemy had treated her with dignity, had given her food, comfort, and the space to heal? Would they even believe her? Would they see her as a traitor for telling the truth? The silence around her deepened, and for a long moment she simply stared at the blank page, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Finally, she picked up the pencil. Her hand shook, but she began to write anyway, the words spilling out onto the page with an urgency that surprised her. "I am safe." Those 3 words were all she could muster. She wrote them slowly, deliberately, as if committing them to paper would make them real. They were simple, honest, and yet they carried the weight of everything she had experienced. She wondered if the letter would ever make it home, if the Japanese authorities would allow it to reach her family. But even if it never did, she was certain of one thing. The very act of writing it had already changed something within her. The letter, though simple, was a message of survival. It was a statement of truth, of something beyond the propaganda she had been fed. In that moment, Kiyomi realized that this was not just a letter to her family, it was a letter to herself. A letter that proved she was still alive, still human, despite everything that had been done to her. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was a message to the world that not all prisoners were broken, that not all enemies were evil. As she folded the letter and handed it back to the cowboy, she felt a strange weight lifting from her shoulders. It wasn't that she had answered all the questions in her heart, but the act of writing, the act of connecting with the world outside the ranch, had somehow reconnected her with herself. For the first time since her capture, she felt like she was more than just a soldier, more than just a prisoner. She was a person again. The cowboy's eyes softened as he took the letter from her, and for the briefest of moments, Kiyomi felt a flicker of something new trust. The next day, she was given a task she could not have imagined in her wildest dreams. It wasn't work in the kitchen, or tending to the chickens. It wasn't another grueling day under the hot Texas sun. No, this time, she was told that she, along with the other women, was to take a bath. A real bath. The words hit her like a blow. A bath. The thought alone felt almost obscene. For months, she had lived in filth, her body caked with dirt, sweat, and the remnants of war. Her skin had been a canvas of dust, her hair tangled and brittle from the lack of care. The idea of standing under warm water, letting it wash over her, seemed like something from a dream. It was too foreign, too kind, and for a moment she almost recoiled. What kind of enemy gave its prisoners this luxury? The small room where they were to bathe was simple, its white tiles gleaming under the harsh overhead lights. The women were handed bars of soap, real soap, thick and fragrant, unlike the chemical substitutes they had used during the war. They were given towels, too, soft towels that smelled of fresh linen, the scent almost overwhelming after years of using scraps of fabric and whatever they could find. Kiyomi hesitated, standing at the edge of the shower, her bare feet touching the cool tile floor. The water steamed gently, beckoning her. But she stood still for a moment, her mind clouded with uncertainty. She glanced at the other women, all of them, nervously eyeing the shower. Some had already stepped in, their eyes wide with disbelief as they let the water run over their heads, their hands trembling as they scrubbed their bodies. Kiyomi slowly stepped forward, feeling the heat of the water as it hit her skin. At first, it felt foreign, almost painful in its warmth. Her body, so accustomed to the cold and the hardships of war, tensed at the sensation. But then, the water began to soothe her, and something inside her shifted. She reached for the soap, rubbing it between her hands. The lather was thick and luxurious, something she hadn't felt in years. She scrubbed herself, harder and harder, as if trying to erase the marks the war had left on her body and soul. The soap, the warmth, the sensation of being cared for, of being allowed to exist without fear, it was almost too much for her to bear. She could feel the years of brutality and fear, of constant vigilance and survival, slipping away with each scrub, each pass of the towel over her skin. The act of washing herself was more than just physical. It became an emotional cleansing, an attempt to wash away the years of suffering, of being used as a tool in a war she never wanted to fight. She had been reduced to an object, first a soldier, then a prisoner, and, in some ways, still just a body to be cared for. But in the shower, under the flow of hot water, she felt herself return to something else, something human, something whole. When she stepped out, Kiyomi stood in front of the mirror, her body still wet with droplets of water. She stared at her reflection, and for the first time in months, she didn't recognize the girl who stared back at her. Her face was softer, her hair slick and clean. She looked different, cleaner, yes, but also somehow more fragile. The mirror revealed a woman who had been marked by war, whose body bore the scars of captivity, but it also showed a woman who had been cared for, who had been given something she hadn't realized she needed until now, dignity. The difference was unsettling. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first arrived at the camp, the girl who had been numb to everything, consumed only by survival. She wasn't a soldier anymore. She wasn't a prisoner either. She was a woman, a person, standing in front of a mirror, trying to figure out who she was now that survival was no longer just about enduring pain, but about embracing care. But with that came a weight of guilt. How could she accept this kindness from the enemy? How could she reconcile the image of the Americans as cruel, monstrous men with the reality of them offering her this? It felt like a betrayal of everything she had been taught. And yet, deep down, she knew she could never go back to the person she had been. The war had taken so much from her, but it hadn't taken this. It hadn't taken her humanity. The days that followed felt like a delicate balance between two worlds. On one side was the Kiyomi, who had been raised to believe in honor and loyalty, who had sworn to die rather than surrender, who had been taught that the Americans were subhuman, monstrous invaders. On the other side was the woman she was becoming, the woman who had received a blanket and been treated with care, the woman who had been fed, bathed, and given kindness by the very enemy she had been trained to fear. These two versions of herself were at odds, constantly clashing in her mind, and the weight of that conflict was too much to bear. Every day, Kiyomi fought the battle within herself. She could feel it in the way her heart raced when she passed the soldiers in the camp, in the way her hands trembled when they spoke to her with kindness instead of cruelty. The men who had been labeled as heartless, brutal invaders were anything but. They were human. They had shown her humanity, and that made it harder and harder to hold on to the beliefs she had been raised with. It was as though the very foundation of her identity was crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of reality. One afternoon, as she was standing in line for her next meal, one of the cowboys came toward her. He was holding a piece of bread, a simple, crusty loaf that smelled fresh from the oven. He handed it to her without a word, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. And in that moment, everything changed. Kiyomi took the bread, her fingers brushing against his as he passed it to her. The contact was brief, but it felt electric. It was a simple act, something so small and inconsequential. But to Kiyomi, it was monumental. She stared at the bread in her hands, her mind whirling with confusion. This was the enemy who had taken everything from her, and yet here he was, offering her something as basic as food. There was no sneer, no mockery in his gaze, only a quiet, almost gentle kindness. In that brief exchange, Kiyomi felt the walls she had spent so long building to protect herself begin to crack. She couldn't reconcile the image of the Americans she had been taught to fear with the reality of the man who had just offered her bread. She should have been afraid of him, should have hated him, but instead she saw nothing but a man offering something small, something kind. How could she hate him when he had treated her better than the very people she had sworn loyalty to? Her mind reeled as she stood there, clutching the bread, feeling a strange warmth spread through her chest. This man, this cowboy, who had been painted as a monster, was nothing like what she had been led to believe. And in that moment, a deep disillusionment began to take root inside her. How could she continue to follow the teachings of a country that had abandoned her, that had turned its back on her and so many others? How could she remain loyal to a cause that had left her to be treated like a prisoner by those she had once been taught to hate? The emotional toll was unbearable. The guilt she felt for accepting kindness from her captors weighed heavily on her. But it wasn't just guilt, it was confusion, and it was anger. Anger at the lies she had been fed, at the propaganda that had twisted her view of the world. She was a prisoner, yes, but she had been treated with dignity, with humanity, something her own country had never given her. The battle inside her was far from over. There would be more moments of doubt, more moments of guilt, but in that small exchange, in that quiet act of kindness, Kiyomi had taken the first step toward freedom, not physical freedom, but emotional and psychological freedom. She had begun to release herself from the chains of indoctrination and hatred that had held her for so long. And with each step, the walls that had once kept her safe from the truth began to crumble. It was one of those small, seemingly insignificant moments that would come to define Kiyomi's transformation. She was walking past the camp's kitchen when she noticed a young American girl standing by the door, holding something in her hands. The girl was no older than Kiyomi's own sister had been when the war began, a child with a bright smile and wide eyes that looked out at the world with innocence Kiyomi had long since lost. She caught Kiyomi's eye and, without a word, extended her hand. In her palm, the girl held a small, delicate ribbon, bright red, made of silky fabric, the kind that young girls might wear to keep their hair neat. It was simple, almost childlike in its innocence, but to Kiyomi it felt like a gift far beyond its physical form. The ribbon was not just an accessory, it was a symbol, an offering of care, of something more than survival. The young American girl smiled shyly, her eyes hopeful, and in that moment, Kiyomi understood. The ribbon was not just a gesture of kindness, it was a lifeline, a thread that connected Kiyomi to the parts of herself she had almost forgotten, the parts of herself that were not defined by the war, the captivity, or the cruelty she had endured. She had been so focused on surviving, so consumed by the war and its aftermath, that she had lost sight of what it meant to simply be a person, to be a woman, a girl, with the freedom to make choices, to be seen not as a soldier or a prisoner, but as something human. Kiyomi hesitated for a moment, then took the ribbon from the girl's hand. She didn't say anything. Words felt too heavy for a moment like this. Instead, she tied the ribbon into her hair, feeling the soft fabric slip through her fingers as she worked it into place. The act of it was simple, but it felt like an act of defiance. It was a reclaiming of something she had lost: her identity, her dignity, her very humanity. She wasn't a tool of war anymore. She wasn't a prisoner to be broken. She was just a girl again, someone who could wear a ribbon, someone who could be seen for who she truly was. The next time Kiyomi sat down to write her letter, it was different. The words she had written before, those simple words, "I am safe," had been the only ones she could manage in her state of survival. But now, with the ribbon in her hair and a renewed sense of self, the letter felt different. This time, she didn't just write about surviving. She wrote about dignity. She wrote about the kindness she had received from the Americans, about the small acts of humanity that had pierced through the darkness she had been living in. "I am safe," she wrote. But this time, the words felt full of meaning. "I am treated with care," she added. "I am seen." It was the first time she had written those words, and they felt like a proclamation. She was not just a victim of war, not just a broken thing to be pitied. She was a person, someone worthy of care, worthy of being treated as something more than a prisoner. She had been given the gift of being seen, and that, in itself, had changed her. If you're feeling moved by Kiyomi's journey and transformation, please give this video a like. Leave a comment below, letting us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this powerful story of survival, dignity, and change. The days passed slowly, the camp's daily rhythm becoming a strange comfort for Kiyomi. The work was steady, the meals still plentiful, and each passing day chipped away at the hard shell of distrust she had worn like armor. Her body grew stronger, filling out in ways that surprised her, her once gaunt frame now softer, her limbs less fragile. Her face had changed too. The lines of exhaustion had softened, and though the memories of the past remained, she felt them fade into the distance, replaced by the strange, gentle reality of her days on the ranch. It wasn't just the physical transformation that marked Kiyomi's change. It was the emotional shift that accompanied it. The girl who had arrived at the camp, silent, broken, unsure of herself, was no longer there. In her place stood a woman who had survived, who had been treated with kindness and dignity, and who had learned to reclaim her own humanity. She had been given more than food and comfort. She had been given the freedom to heal, to remember that she was not defined by the war or her captivity. But as the day of repatriation arrived, Kiyomi knew that leaving this place, this strange world of unexpected kindness, was not as simple as just walking away. The morning was still, the air thick with the weight of unspoken goodbyes. The women were gathered on the dock, their belongings packed in small, unremarkable bags, their faces a mixture of uncertainty and relief. Some were quiet, others whispered amongst themselves, but Kiyomi stood apart, feeling the strange weight of her own thoughts. As the ship's engines hummed to life, a finality settled in her chest. She had been given a ticket back to Japan, to a life she no longer recognized. The world she had left torn apart by bombs, by loss, by propaganda was waiting for her, but it was a world that no longer fit her. The woman she had become on the ranch, stronger, quieter, more at peace, could not simply step back into the life she had once known. She looked at the American soldiers standing on the dock, their faces unreadable but their gestures clear. As she stepped onto the ship, one of them tipped his hat to her. It was a simple gesture, a quiet acknowledgement, but to Kiyomi it meant more than she could put into words. She nodded once, a single, silent movement. There was no bitterness, no anger, only a strange, quiet gratitude. She had learned so much in the time she had spent here, lessons that would stay with her for the rest of her life. As the ship pulled away from the dock, Kiyomi stood at the railing, her hands gripping the cold metal. She didn't look back, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew there was no need. The men on the dock were not her enemies anymore. They were men who had treated her with care, with respect, in a way she had never expected. They had given her something she hadn't known she needed, a glimpse of the humanity she had almost lost. But Japan, when she arrived, would be different. The country she was returning to, the one defined by its military, its propaganda, its demands of loyalty, was not the world she now belonged to. It felt like a strange land, foreign and distant, a place she no longer understood. She had been reshaped, remade by her experiences, and the world she was stepping back into would no longer fit her. As the days at sea passed, Kiyomi's thoughts were filled with the quiet weight of this departure. It was not just a physical journey home, but an emotional one as well. The home she was returning to was a place that no longer held the meaning it once had. The woman who had stepped onto that ship was different than the girl who had been sent to fight, to endure, to survive. She was returning, yes, but not as the same person. The world she had known would never feel the same again. When Kiyomi stepped off the ship in Japan, the air felt different. The humid, salt-kissed breeze was familiar, but it didn't offer the comfort she had expected. She looked around, trying to recognize something in the cityscape, any trace of the home she had left behind. But the streets seemed more distant now, the faces of the people passing by less familiar. The world she had left was not the same as the one she had returned to. Japan, with its cities and quiet fields, was no longer the place she had known, the place she had fought for. As she walked through the port, her thoughts raced, trying to connect the person she had become with the place she had once called home. She could still feel the weight of the ribbon in her hair, the softness of the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She had learned so much about herself in captivity, but now, in the land that had once shaped her identity, everything felt foreign. She had been treated with kindness by the people she had been taught to fear, and that truth, burned within her like a quiet fire. She could never go back to the way things were. She had been given a glimpse of a life that valued dignity over strength, humanity over power, and she couldn't unsee it. Reintegrating into Japanese society wasn't as simple as returning to the same routine. The world she returned to was a place that didn't understand her transformation, couldn't possibly comprehend it. Her family greeted her with joy, but it was the joy of someone who had returned home, not someone who had been fundamentally changed. They saw her as they had always seen her, a daughter, a sister, but she was no longer just that. She had been to a place where survival wasn't simply about enduring pain, but about reclaiming one's humanity. They couldn't understand how deeply that change had penetrated her soul, how much it had shifted her view of the world. But when she returned to Japan, she found that the country she had once fought for, the ideals she had once believed in, had been shattered. There was no room in the world she knew for the lessons she had learned. The Japan she returned to was a place still defined by the war, by the ideals of duty and sacrifice, by a society that had been built on the notion of selfless service to the emperor. The ideals she had fought for, loyalty, honor, and obedience, had been twisted, distorted. And now, standing here, Kiyomi knew that those ideals no longer held the same meaning for her. She had been broken by the war, but she had also been healed. She had been shown what it meant to be treated with humanity, to be treated as a person first, not as a tool of war. She couldn't go back to the way things were. Japan, with its call to sacrifice, to endure without question, could not offer her the same sense of belonging it once had. But as she stood in the streets, looking at her family and the familiar faces of her neighbors, Kiyomi realized something. She was different, yes, but she was also stronger. She had learned that dignity and humanity were the most valuable things a person could have, and those, she realized, were things no one could take away from her. If you found this story moving, please like the video and comment below telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for remembering this piece of history and its lessons.